Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 50 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Nashville Predators and lost by a score of 7-5. Now, it was pointed out to me in the comments of my video yesterday that today's video was going to end up being my 1,000th posted to this channel, and what a 1,000th video it's going to end up being, as the Sharks give us, let's just say, a memorable performance here tonight in Nashville. You see, on the surface, this would look like the perfect game that a Sharks fan would want out of San Jose this season. Not only do they drive up the score here by putting up 5 goals on the board, which gives us some entertainment, but also all of the Sharks' young guys managed to get involved offensively. Celebrini, Will Smith, William Eklund all have their fingerprints on this game. And ultimately, the Sharks end up losing so as to not hurt their draft position as well. What more could you possibly ask for? But it is how this game plays out that ends up leaving it feeling extremely disappointing. You see, over these last few games, I have talked about how I would much rather see the Sharks lose a game 7-5, for instance, than to see them lose a nail-biter 2-1, because at least you have some entertainment with all of the goals being scored. But this is in reference to the type of game that is of a back-and-forth affair, where the Sharks have a 2-1 lead, then it's taken back by Nashville, then it's tied by the Sharks, and then Nashville gets back in the lead, and so on and so forth, where even if the Sharks come out on the losing side of things, at least you had some fun. Here tonight, however, the Sharks take a 5-1 lead early in the second period, then give up 6 unanswered goals to lose this one in regulation 7-5 to Nashville. And that turns this game into one of the worst of the entire season. And that is saying something, because the Sharks have had some real stinker type of performances, especially as of late. Just a few days ago, that 4-1 loss to the New York Islanders, where the Sharks didn't even seem to show up to play. A few weeks prior to that, the 4-0 shutout loss to the Flyers. There was a game that the Sharks lost 8-1 to the Tampa Bay Lightning this season. This one is right up there with those. And the reason for that is, at the very least, those types of lopsided losses are pretty easy to move past. Teams, players, they've all had these types of losses before, and you kind of put them in the rearview mirror. But a loss like this one, where you had a very real opportunity of winning with a 4-goal lead in the early parts of the second, that is a much more difficult pill to swallow. That is a lot more difficult to kind of just look past and move forward with your life. And so that kind of puts this season right now at a crossroads for the San Jose Sharks, and it'll be extremely interesting to see how the Sharks respond to this one, especially since their next game on Thursday is against this very same Nashville Predators team, and it can go in these two different directions. The first of which is if things begin to spiral out of control. We know that the San Jose Sharks last year, there was a lot of despair by the end of that season, where players got very complacent and were just essentially going through the motions until the season finally ended in the middle of April, because they lost that belief. They lost that flame in themselves in thinking that they can actually win each and every game that they play in. And you don't want to see that happen again this season. And yet, this was the type of game that almost reinforces that belief. The fact that the Sharks have a 4-1 lead and then it still ends up getting away from them, how are you really going to keep up the motivation and the excitement as these goals get scored in future games? You're always going to have in the back of your mind that, well, we blew that 4-goal lead the other day. How are we going to actually hold on to this one? It's something that the Sharks have been trying to get away from, where they're attempting to instill the idea of when you have a lead, you want to continue to play to win instead of just starting to play to not lose. But when you blow a 4-goal lead like this, it's hard to start to really get away from that. So that is one direction things can go, where it just really creates this spiral out of control and almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the Sharks end up losing a lot of games over and over in pretty ugly fashion. The other direction that it can take is one where you use this game as motivation moving forward. And I'll call reference to something that just happened a few days ago elsewhere in the NHL with the Montreal Canadiens. Now, they've been on a hot streak as of late. They have really roared back into the playoff picture and may very well find themselves currently in a playoff spot. I haven't taken an updated look at the standings. But it was a few days ago where they went up against their longtime rival, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they held a 3-0 lead, Montreal did, by the end of that first period. In the second, however, and moving forward into the rest of the game, they gave up 7 unanswered goals to eventually end up losing that game 7-3. A very similar situation to what happened to the Sharks here tonight in Nashville. And yet, Montreal, what they did is they got right back on that horse and have won their last 2 games since then, including one here tonight against the Tampa Bay Lightning. They have used that as a particularly ugly, but still a speed bump on their road towards the playoffs. Now, I'm not deluding myself into believing that this could possibly be some sort of turning point for San Jose where they rattle off 32 straight wins and end up miraculously making the playoffs this season. But what you do want to see San Jose get back to, and perhaps this could be that type of game that really sparks that, is being more competitive more often. As of late, the Sharks just haven't quite had that ability to do so. There have been so many games against the Islanders, against the Flyers, against the Blue Jackets, against the Utah Hockey Club, where the Sharks just haven't particularly been engaged. They haven't had that level of energy necessary to really compete at the highest level, something that they did have in the earlier parts of this season, in particular during the month of November. This type of loss could spark that type of performance from returning. Again, it comes down to this crossroads point, and it is why I'm so interested in seeing how the Sharks perform in their next game against Nashville yet again, back in San Jose, back at home. Now, when it comes to this game playing out, as I mentioned, a lead that is completely thrown away. The first period starts off very well for San Jose. Celebrini scores early, then it is added to with a goal from Cunnin, then it is Mikael Granlund. The Predators would respond briefly with a goal that makes it 3-1, but Wallman in the dying seconds of the first makes it 4-1, and then early in the second, it is a 5-1 game as Granlund pots one on the power play. And at that point, you think the Sharks are in a great spot, even though the Predators pulled their goaltender heading into the second period. The Sharks still managed to get one on him there. That feels as though the momentum is all in the Sharks' favor. But from that point onward, San Jose basically doesn't even step foot, barely, in the offensive zone as the Predators rattle off goal after goal after goal, 2 in the second period to cut this lead to 2. And then in the third, you're thinking the Sharks can maybe have a bit of a calm down moment in the intermission there, think that they're going to be able to come out with a bit more of a best foot forward, and then just 30 seconds in, it is Marchessault who cuts the lead to 1, and then at that point it feels inevitable that that game-tying goal would be found, and indeed it happened with a goal from Roman Josi on the power play, and then eventually it is Blankenberg on the game winner, the eventual game winner, who makes it 6-5, and it is only then, about 30 minutes later, after that last Granlund goal was scored on the power play early in the second, where the Sharks finally seem to wake up and are actually able to get some shifts back in the offensive zone. And they got some decent chances, don't get me wrong, but eventually it is an empty netter that puts this one away, and a 7-5 Predators victory. Moving on to the players to talk about, this is obviously a very difficult game to really evaluate because there were just such wildly different portions of this one. If you're just taking a look at the first period, it would feel as though many of these players had just absolutely outstanding games. And then if you look at that 30-minute stretch in the middle of this one, suddenly it looks significantly worse. And especially since the Sharks did end up losing this game, the thing that really sticks with you is all the mistakes that San Jose made. And so one might have the tendency to look at these players and say, you had a bad game, and you had a bad game, and you had a bad game. I'll try to take more of a kind of level approach with at least some of them who I do still think had very positive outings here tonight, even if they themselves probably wouldn't say that just based on the result. And we start off with the Sharks top line of Eklund, Celebrini, and they are joined yet again by Alex Wennberg. And this caught me once more by surprise, especially since Kovalenko did return to the lineup, as I thought Kovalenko would end up taking the spot and Wennberg would return to the place he has found himself in through the majority of this season, the third-line center spot. But Warsofsky sticks with it, and this is an interesting decision that comes with its own pros and cons. Now, the pros is that it does kind of shield Kovalenko in a way, since this is his first game back in the lineup in a bit. He's missed a couple of weeks at this point, and he would be playing on a top line with Celebrini and Eklund, while the Predators are the home team and have the ability to really put on the matchups that they wanted. It could have been a bit of a difficult adjustment and reintegration period for him into the lineup, and so keeping Wennberg there is maybe a better move in a way because of that. On top of that, Wennberg does give a bit more of a kind of defensive option, and also the ability to take take a faceoff if Celebrini ends up getting kicked out of the faceoff dot, or even just take the faceoffs over Celebrini as well, something that Kovalenko really wouldn't end up doing. But the cons to this is that it really hurts one major strength that the Sharks actually have at this point in their lineup, which is their center depth. I mean, Sturm was injured here tonight, but when he's in the lineup, the Sharks can run Celebrini, Granlund, Wenberg, and Sturm. This might not be playoff caliber, but it's definitely better than just last place in the entire league level of center depth. But with Wenberg playing up on the wing, it is hurt for sure, as now Cunnin has to move to the center position where he is okay but not great in, and suddenly your bottom six looks a lot weaker because of it. Now, with all of that being said, how did this top line work out? Well, it started this game off exceptionally well. When it comes to Alex Wenberg, I have talked about him in the past as how he has always really just been this very level player, where maybe sometimes he'll have these above average games, maybe sometimes he'll have these below average games, but more often than not, he's just kind of an unremarkable player in the sense that you don't really notice him a ton. But here tonight, especially at the start, or primarily at the start, I should say, Wenberg looked really, really good. Now, he is obviously missing that Toffoli aspect of actually being a strong scorer. We saw Wenberg at times really try to be more of that playmaker, and at times even hold on to the puck a little bit too long in the offensive zone, I felt, and not being willing to be that shooting option. But still, I thought he worked it in the offensive zone really well, and just judging by the first 25 or so minutes of this game, I thought this was one of Wenberg's best performances of the season for sure. Now, of course, that middle part certainly hurts that, but even then, I don't think Wenberg was necessarily that bad, and so I was impressed to see what he was able to do on this Sharks top line. When it comes to Macklin Celebrini, I was also quite impressed with what he was able to do. A fantastic start to this one where he manages to get that goal. He also picks up an assist on the Granlund power play goal, so 2 points for him tonight. He had some great looks near the end of that third period when the Sharks finally woke up after falling behind 6-5. He probably could have had an extra point or two here tonight, and so I can't be too disappointed with what he did. Again, trying to not put so much emphasis on that 20 minutes, 30-minute period where the Sharks were just genuinely terrible. And then we have William Eklund, who I thought was maybe a little bit of a weak link on this top line, which is surprising to say, because usually you would think it would be Eklund and Celebrini leading the way and Wenberg struggling to keep up, but I really appreciated Wenberg's effort. It's not saying much, because I do still think Eklund was relatively solid, but maybe could have asked for a little bit more from him. Still pretty good, puts up a couple of points, can't be too upset. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Granlund with Zetterlund and Will Smith. Smith manages to get on the board as well. I mentioned earlier on, all of the Sharks' young players that you do want to see involved did manage to be involved. He had a great pass on this Mikael Granlund goal, that the first one that he scored that had originally made it 3-0. He had a strong screen in front, which is not something that you usually see from Will Smith, on the Luke Cunnin goal that made it 2-0. So he obviously contributed quite positively in this one, but at the same time, there were some mistakes for sure. He gets called for a penalty here, which actually leads to the first of the many unanswered goals for Nashville, the Svechkov goal, which I thought was a really, really bad call. Smith sort of puts his arm on Svechkov, actually, the eventual goal scorer. He puts his arm around him. Svechkov grabs his arm and then essentially drags Smith down to the ground, and the ref calls Smith for holding, which I thought was very confusing. And then funnily enough, later on in this game, I believe William Eklund gets called for a very, very similar type of penalty, where again, he puts his arm on a Nashville player who grabs him and then falls down onto the ice, giving Eklund the holding penalty. So that one I didn't see as close of a look on. I feel as though the Smith one was definitely a really bad call. So that leads to that first goal, but it is the second one here by Nashville in this period from Barron that makes it 5-3. That is a really bad look for Smith. Now, he is in the correct place positionally in the defensive zone, but it is something that has been a bit of an issue for him this season, is that he's not keeping his head on a swivel. So even if you're in the correct spot, if your man is actually moving, you got to be able to track him and follow him. Smith does not do this, and that leaves Barron there for that open net tap-in that, again, brings the Predators to within 2. So weaknesses for sure on display at times here tonight for Will Smith, but I still can't be too upset, as the positive positives were also very much on display. And when it comes to a young player like Will Smith, I'm more so looking for those positives out of a game, even if it does come with some negatives, instead of just like an even keel, no impact level of performance from him. So this still ends up being, in my opinion, a good game for Smith. When it comes to his two line mates, I thought both Granlund and Zetterlund had a lot of jump here tonight in the early parts. They were skating quite hard. They were making those moves as well. It fell off, obviously, again, that 30-minute period. It didn't look very good, even remotely so, for most of these players. I think that is a point that I'm really trying to hammer home here before people say, oh, but these players were all terrible. I understand that they were indeed quite bad through this stretch of time, but I'm trying to look on the bright side here, as at the very least they showed some fight through half of this game. When it comes to the Sharks' bottom six, however, this is where we do have those issues, even when counting the better parts of this game for San Jose. This line of Cunnin, Graf, and Kovalenko returning to the lineup was really not all that effective. They basically got very few chances on net. Cunnin scores this one goal from pretty far out, but he wasn't even on the ice with his usual line mates. There were mistakes. In particular, I'm taking a look at someone like Colin Graf, who I thought actually made a good chunk of mistakes here tonight. Obviously, that 30-minute stretch in particular, but even in the earlier parts, just not exactly doing a ton. Kovalenko, I thought, was a little bit better. He certainly had some bright moments, but I think his line mates maybe let him down a little bit. And then Luke Cunnin just didn't do really much of anything here tonight except score that goal, and so I wasn't super impressed with this third line. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line that has previously been really, really good, what we ended up seeing is that this fourth line was desperately missing Nico Sturm's presence on it. He provides such an important stabilizing factor, primarily coming from his ability simply to just win faceoffs. We saw this fourth line be on the ice for this one goal that Nashville did end up scoring in the first period. They take the defensive zone faceoff, it is lost, and Nashville converts that into a goal within just a few seconds. If Sturm is on the ice, you've got a very good chance of winning that draw, and this play likely never ends up happening. But even outside of the faceoff, Sturm was a strong player, north-south type of guy. You're playing in the offensive zone usually when Sturm has been on the ice as of late, and without him there, and it being a trio of Grundstrom, Goodrow, and Delandra, it did not look nearly as good. This fourth line really struggled at times throughout much of this game, even in that first period with the Sharks. It seemed as though they could do no wrong. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. Here we have Wallman and Ceci. Tale of two games for both of these players. Wallman had a spectacular, honestly, first period where he was all over the ice. He's making the plays. He scores that goal that makes it 4-1 late in the first period. But it's not just that. He's skating up and out of the zone with the puck. He's making that strong first pass. It felt as though he was playing such a spectacular game, one of his best games of the season to begin. And then the last 40 minutes occur, and it was just a complete disaster. Wallman and Ceci, the two of them, felt as though they were always on the ice for these great chances. Wallman and Ceci just not aware enough about the plays happening around them. This was really where a lot of those major breakdowns occurred when these two players were there, and so there's not a lot of positives to actually be said about them, at least when it came to guys like Celebrini and Wenberg. You could look maybe more so on the bright side, but there were some very, very real issues for Wallman and Ceci here tonight. It's hard to do that for either of them. When it comes to Ferraro and Liljegren, maybe slightly more positive on that end. I thought they did not look nearly as bad as Wallman and Ceci. It's not really saying much, as of course every single defenseman here for the San Jose Sharks had their struggles, and immensely so, throughout this game, considering how hemmed into their own zone that they were through the large chunk of the second and into the third period. But again, it was at least slightly better than what is supposed to be the Sharks' top defensive pairing, so I am appreciative of that. I also did appreciate the fact that Liljegren in particular was being able to actually step up more aggressively from an offensive standpoint, something that he has been very much rarely doing as of late, so maybe that's a step in the right direction, as long as, the Sharks kind of take that one move of actually taking this game as motivation instead of just spiraling out of control with a self-fulfilling prophecy of losses. So we shall see if Liljegren could maybe carry that forward. But in general, the second defensive pairing certainly wasn't good, like very far from it, but they weren't terrible. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. So no Vlasic here tonight, and Thrun was bad, I will say. I really did not appreciate Thrun's effort here tonight. So many times in which he has the ability to get this puck out, but even under the modicum of pressure that Nashville would apply to him, he immediately just gives the puck away, or he has a pass that's so far off the mark that there was no chance a Sharks player would actually be able to catch it. There were a lot of these types of mistakes here tonight, so I was not impressed with what Thrun was doing. Jan Rutta was at the very least not making as many of those types of mistakes, but again, defensively, the Sharks were very suspect here tonight. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Georgiev. So no surprise that he would end up getting this start after the one that Askarov got last game. But I didn't actually consider this last game, but now thinking about it, it is a little bit weird that Askarov was given the start yesterday against Boston, especially since he was going through that illness. One would think that having that extra day to get through it would be smarter, but then also not giving him the game against his former team, the Nashville Predators. That is a bit of a weird disconnection that I was definitely rather surprised about once I actually began to think about it today. When it comes to Georgiev's performance here tonight, it was obviously not good. He lets in 6 goals. Now, to be fair, many of these weren't necessarily his fault. Like this first goal from Novak, definitely a tough save. The goal from Barron, he doesn't really have much of a chance on. The goal from Marchessault, he probably could have had this one with a bit better sort of reactability, I guess. But at the same time, I didn't like Wallman's effort in front. But then you look at like this Yossi goal, maybe there's time to make the save there. And you especially look at the eventual game winner here that makes it 6-5. And this is a save that Georgiev needs to make, especially in such a position for the Sharks where they were clearly extremely mentally fragile, I guess, so to speak. The team basically resting on this knife's edge. And Georgiev is not able to come through. So a 6-goal effort or a game in which he lets in 6 goals, it's never going to look good no matter what, really. Like there's no possible way to spin it in a good direction, but at the same time, a couple of these were ones that he would want back. So a pretty bad game in general for Alexander Georgiev. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. We'll be taking on, again, the Nashville Predators. I already talked about. It'll be very interesting to see how the Sharks actually manage to respond. Will they be able to get their revenge for what ended up happening here tonight? I certainly can say that I won't feel particularly confident with a lead if they do manage to generate that, one of those in that upcoming game, whether it's 2-0, 3-0, 5-0, 100-0. I won't really feel as though that the Sharks have won the game until these 60 minutes have actually fully expired, and maybe that's just the general feeling we're going to have with this team for the rest of the season. Class dismissed.